Kristi Noem walked into Congress today expecting another policy hearing. Instead, she was met with raw grief, unanswered questions, and a confrontation that cut to the heart of America's deepest wound. On the anniversary of one of the darkest days in Buffalo's history, Congressman Tim Kennedy demanded to know why her testimony, pages long, filled with references to foreign enemies and border threats, never once mentioned the kind of terror that stole 10 lives in his own community. 10 families shattered in 123 seconds, yet not a single acknowledgement. This wasn't politics as usual. It was a test of whether leaders will confront the reality of domestic terrorism or hide behind distant threats.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Kennedy from New York for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Noem, thank you for your time before this committee. Today is a solemn day for my community in Buffalo, New York. 3 years ago, on May 14th, 2022, a gunman, motivated by racism and hatred, drove 2.5 hours from his home to the east side of Buffalo to carry out an act of domestic terrorism. Equipped with enhanced body armor, a tactical helmet, and a semi-automatic rifle, the gunman opened fire at a local grocery store in a predominantly black community. In just 123 seconds, he took 10 innocent souls that day, severely injured 3, and traumatized countless other individuals. Because of this act of domestic terrorism, radicalized and indoctrinated online, and carried out in the name of white supremacy, families in my community will never be whole again. Buffalo now joins a growing list of communities impacted by mass shootings carried out by lone wolf, homegrown, domestically radicalized, disturbed individuals. Secretary Noem, in your written testimony today, there's not one mention of this kind of threat to the homeland. You refer to foreign terrorist organizations. You refer to aliens who are affiliated with foreign terrorism. You refer to arrests of suspected gang members. Not once do you mention the term domestic terrorism, domestic terrorist, or lone wolf. There's a gaping hole in your testimony today. You fail to reassure this committee or the American people that you'll protect the homeland from bad actors, radicalized right here in the U.S., like the gunman who opened fire on my community 3 years ago today. There's been a systematic, intentional effort by your department and this administration since January 20th to ignore the very real threat posed by domestic terrorism. This is a blatant negligence made abundantly clear by the administration's budget and by President Trump's broader actions to defund the Department of Homeland Security initiatives that track and prevent domestic terrorism. The Trump administration's budget proposal for the Department of Homeland Security completely eliminates the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, a critical DHS program dedicated to helping local communities, including law enforcement, to develop and strengthen efforts to counter attacks of targeted violence and terrorism, just like the racist Buffalo attack. This exact grant program awarded nearly $1 million in the aftermath of the 5/14 shooting in Western New York to help close research gaps about the radicalization of domestic terrorists, develop violence prevention modules, and improve bystander intervention. This program was also used to harden safety and prevention efforts in other communities that experienced targeted domestic terrorism, including a school shooting in Oakland County, Michigan, and a pattern of other domestic terrorist incidents. The budget proposal you're defending today justifies the elimination of this funding by arguing it was, quote, weaponized to target Americans exercising their First Amendment rights, end quote. If the suggestion that an act of domestic terrorism, which took the lives of 10 innocent people and forever changed my community, qualifies as protected First Amendment speech, then explain that to the families of the victims who were killed that day. Under this administration, we have a Department of Homeland Security that is making excuses for domestic terrorists under the guise of free speech and insulting communities like mine, especially on a day like today, as we mark the anniversary of unimaginable violence and loss. We can do better, and we must do better. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama.
And the silence in Noem's words raised a chilling question whose pain counts and whose safety gets overlooked. When Tim Kennedy began to speak, the room shifted. He wasn't reading statistics off a page or trading partisan jabs. He was carrying the grief of Buffalo straight into the halls of Congress. 3 years had passed since a young man fueled by racism and radicalized online drove more than 2 hours to deliberately hunt down innocent lives in a neighborhood grocery store. 10 people were murdered in less than 2 minutes. 3 more were left critically wounded, and the trauma of that day still hangs heavy over families who can never go back to normal. Kennedy's words reminded everyone that for those families this wasn't history, it was still happening. Every birthday, every holiday, every empty chair at the dinner table is a reminder of what was stolen. Yet in Kristi Noem's testimony not one reference appeared to this reality. No mention of domestic terrorism. No recognition of lone wolves radicalized at home. To Kennedy, that silence wasn't just an oversight. It was proof that the very people sworn to protect communities like Buffalo were choosing not to see their pain. And in that silence he saw something far more dangerous than bureaucracy. He saw denial. But what he revealed next made that denial impossible to ignore. Kennedy didn't hold back. He pointed straight to the pages of Kristi Noem's testimony, reading them like a ledger of what was prioritized and what was ignored. Foreign terrorist organizations, mentioned. Border crossings and cartel activity, highlighted. Arrests of suspected gang members, carefully documented. But domestic terrorism, the very threat that had devastated Buffalo and so many other American towns, was missing. Not a single line, not a single word. That omission, Kennedy argued, wasn't small. It was a gaping hole. Because while the Department of Homeland Security was busy focusing on dangers abroad, the reality was that many of the deadliest threats were growing right here at home. Radicalized young men in online echo chambers. Lone wolves convinced by hate-filled propaganda that violence made them powerful. Communities like Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Charleston, and El Paso have already paid the price. For Kennedy, this wasn't theoretical policy failure, it was personal betrayal. By refusing to name the threat, DHS was refusing to confront it. And that refusal didn't just leave communities vulnerable. It sent a dangerous message that the pain of American families shattered by domestic terror was less important than political talking points. But the testimony wasn't the only thing Kennedy exposed. The deeper problem stretched back to the budgets that shaped DHS priorities in the first place. Kennedy reminded the chamber that words on a page aren't the only problem, budgets reveal the truth. And when it came to funding, the truth was devastating. The Department of Homeland Security had quietly dismantled one of the few lifelines communities had to prevent tragedies like Buffalo. The Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program once funneled resources into local law enforcement, schools, and nonprofits, helping them recognize warning signs before hate turned deadly. After the Buffalo Massacre, that program sent nearly $1 million to Western New York to fund research, create prevention modules, and train bystanders to intervene when they saw someone slipping toward extremism. It wasn't just Buffalo that benefited. Oakland County, Michigan received support after a school shooting. Other towns scarred by domestic attacks relied on those funds to build resilience and strengthen defenses. But the latest DHS budget proposal eliminated the program entirely, justifying the cut by claiming it had been weaponized against Americans exercising free speech. Kennedy's voice sharpened at that point. How could a program designed to stop racially motivated massacres be equated with silencing First Amendment rights? To him, the cut wasn't about free speech at all, it was about turning away from a growing danger. And the next argument revealed just how twisted that justification had become. The justification stunned Kennedy, and his outrage was palpable. DHS argued that the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program was being misused to police speech. But to families in Buffalo, that explanation felt like an insult. Kennedy drove the point home. How could the cold-blooded murder of 10 people ever be mistaken for free expression? How could an act fueled by white supremacy, executed with military-style weapons, be written off as anything other than terrorism? For the families left behind, this wasn't a debate over constitutional theory. It was funerals. It was anniversaries drenched in grief. It was children growing up without parents, parents burying their children. And to suggest that this violence somehow lived in the same category as political opinion wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Kennedy framed the contradiction with brutal clarity. If government leaders equate domestic terror with free speech, they strip away the tools communities need to stop the next attack. Worse, they legitimize the very hatred that pushes extremists over the edge. His words drew a line in the sand. This wasn't about partisan ideology. It was about whether leaders had the courage to call murder what it was. And that's when Kennedy's confrontation turned sharply personal, forcing Kristi Noem herself into the spotlight. By this point, Kennedy's words weren't aimed at a faceless bureaucracy. They were directed squarely at Kristi Noem. He challenged her not as a policymaker delivering testimony, but as the official responsible for speaking to families who had already lost everything. Why, he asked, should they accept excuses? Why should they sit in silence while the Department of Homeland Security erases their suffering from its priorities? He painted a vivid picture: dinner tables with empty chairs, birthdays that would never be celebrated, anniversaries marked not with joy but with grief. To Kennedy, every omission in Noem's testimony wasn't just a missing phrase, it was another wound inflicted on communities already struggling to heal. And he made clear that this wasn't a debate she could dodge. For those families, DHS budgets and political spin don't matter. What matters is whether their children come home from school, whether their grandparents return safely from a grocery store, whether hate-fueled violence is stopped before it strikes again. Kennedy demanded that Noem explain her silence, not to him but to the grieving families she overlooked. In that moment, he turned the hearing into something more than a policy fight. It became a moral reckoning. But Kennedy wasn't just speaking for Buffalo. His warning carried implications for the entire nation. Kennedy's confrontation with Kristi Noem wasn't only about Buffalo, it was about America itself. The massacre in his community was not an isolated event. It was part of a grim pattern stretching across the nation: Charleston, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Uvalde. Each time the story followed the same path: a lone individual radicalized online, armed with deadly weapons, and convinced that hatred could make them powerful. And each time families were left broken while leaders struggled to even name the threat. Kennedy argued that treating these attacks as one-offs only guarantees their return. Every time domestic terrorism is ignored or downplayed, extremists receive a dangerous signal that their actions will be dismissed as anomalies, not recognized as a systemic threat. And when prevention programs are cut, that signal grows even louder. This, Kennedy warned, was the true national security crisis, not only the violence itself, but the political reluctance to face it. The question was no longer whether communities like Buffalo would be targeted again, it was when. And so he challenged the committee and the country to decide: would America continue to focus on distant threats while ignoring the ones already tearing communities apart? Or would it finally have the courage to confront the danger growing within? In the end, Kennedy's words carried more than outrage, they carried a choice. America can no longer afford to look away from the reality of domestic terrorism. Communities like Buffalo, scarred forever by hate-fueled violence, deserve more than condolences. They deserve leaders willing to name the threat, fund prevention, and act before tragedy strikes again. Kristi Noem's silence became symbolic of a larger failure, the failure to prioritize American lives over political spin. To Kennedy, this wasn't about left or right, it was about right or wrong. Because when leaders downplay domestic terror, they don't just miss an opportunity to prevent the next attack, they legitimize it. They send a signal that extremists can exploit. For families who live with empty chairs and anniversaries marked by grief, that signal is unbearable. Their message is simple: never again. But never again only becomes reality if policymakers back their words with courage, funding, and accountability. So the real question is not whether Congress will debate this issue. The question is whether the rest of us will stay engaged after the cameras are off. Will we demand accountability? Will we honor the victims by refusing to let their deaths fade into silence? Because the fight for justice doesn't end in Congress, it begins with us.